Why do cities grow outwards? Well, as we saw, population growth plays a role. Now we're going to take a look at the role a declining inner city plays in the horizontal expansion of an urban structure. So off we go to part two. First, let's take a quick look again at a couple of the models just so we're oriented with and to the areas we're going to examine. With the concentric zone model, we know that the CBD is the oldest part of the city and is distinguished by vertical development, in many cases at least, skyscrapers maybe, and generally low population density, as very few people live there, having been forced out by increasing property values combined with increasing property taxes, along with decreasing residences over time. Those residential areas, the homes, being torn down and converted to larger structures that house businesses. The zone of transition that immediately surrounds the CBD is the factory and industrial zone, but contains housing in probably very old buildings and or high-density apartments. This might blur with the third zone, the zone of independent workers, so-called. So really, zones 1, 2, and 3 may all be part of the inner city, depending on the city in question. If we look at the sector model, recall that in the so-called low-class housing, that's Hoyt's terminology, not mine, that's his from 100 years ago, which basically means poorer neighborhoods, are just off the CBD and run parallel to the transportation and industrial corridor. In this case, that third zone would be considered part of the inner city. Inner cities decline in three ways: physical decline, economic decline, and social decline. And naturally, all three of these can be occurring simultaneously and oftentimes are. Here's a quick and very general history of the American city. For the moment, I'm going to leave out Chinese neighborhoods and Chinatowns, but I'll come back to that. The inner city was originally a zone of settlement, of course, and it housed the wealthy in the 19th and early 20th centuries. This was, demographically speaking, overwhelmingly white people. Then, as we saw in the section of the class devoted to population geography, relatively poor immigrants from Europe began to arrive in the late 19th, early 20th century. As is often the case, these immigrants worked in the factories and blue-collar labor sector and small localized businesses that served their community and lived close to their workplaces. They began to concentrate in the so-called inner city, occupying apartments and subdivided houses, oftentimes multiple generations and multiple families in the same space. If you've seen The Godfather, the early Robert De Niro scenes depict this with Italian immigrants in New York City. These European immigrants were largely Italian, Irish, Polish, and Jewish at that time. Many, probably most of the original wealthy inhabitants of this area, the inner city, did not want to be in the same neighborhoods with these new immigrants who were treated in hyper-bigoted ways. Their languages, their customs, their religions, their skin tone, food, and all of the rest were mocked and looked down upon. Because of these things, and because the original inhabitants were either getting very old or dying off or dead, the descendants of the original inhabitants of the inner city moved out to the suburbs where there was much less diversity. However, they oftentimes kept the inner city property, subdivided it, and then rented it as an income property. As African Americans began to move into especially northern and western cities like Boston, New York, Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, being drawn there by factory jobs in a variety of industries, but many of these related to the two world wars combined with the growth of the automobile industry. They, African Americans, also concentrated in the inner city where the rents were the cheapest. And in many cases, they did not or could not actually purchase the properties that they lived in. And they became long-term renters with their money going to the descendants of the original property owners. And as their populations began to grow in the inner city, those aforementioned European immigrants, the Italians, Irish, Polish, Jews, began to move away from them and out towards the suburbs. Over the last 60 years or so, many Latin American and Asian immigrants have moved into these very places where African Americans had been the dominant group of people for half a century. This has caused the African American population to move out to the next ring of housing, that original suburban zone, zone number 3. Why does this happen, this migration movement pattern? Why? Well, the poorest people tend to group in the poorest and cheapest housing. And so there's a slow, sometimes relatively quick, turnover of the neighborhoods. Particularly, new immigrants generally concentrate together for the sake of sameness and security. Linguistic sameness, religious sameness, food, cultural, all of those sorts of things going together. As one group moves in, another group moves out. Is this racism? Yeah, probably that drives a lot of it. And it seems that many people prefer to be around people who are like them in at least some distinguishing ways, like language, food, religion, and probably other cultural characteristics. Take a look at this map of Chicago. The black dots are African American dominated areas, the red dots are Hispanic dominated areas, and the green dots are white dominated areas. Although there is some mixing, it's clear there are concentrations. And anyone who knows Chicago also knows there's a substantial Arab population in Chicago, a substantial Asian population, and there's continuing European immigration, particularly from places in Eastern Europe like Poland. But what is also obvious is that certain neighborhoods are dominated by particular ethnic or racial groups. You can see that by looking at this map. It is a version of segregation. Some of it's self-segregation, and some of it is racial-based segregation, as we will see. But as you certainly know, without me telling you this, we can look at any major city in the United States and find a similar landscape. Even other places in the world have, for lack of a better way of putting this, segregated zones. Naturally, while the numbers of poor, low-income people in the inner city increase, they put outward pressure on the surrounding nearby neighborhoods. By that, I mean they slowly begin to take up residence in parts of the city and the neighborhoods that they did not formerly reside in. This generally causes the residents who were there to move to neighborhoods with people that are more like them. The original term for this was, as you can see on the screen, white flight. This occurs when a neighborhood that was previously dominated by white people or people of European ancestry move out of a neighborhood because of an influx of people of color, be they African Americans, Hispanic, Asian, or whatever. That process is helped along by a couple of other mitigating factors. First, something known as blockbusting. Although this is illegal, it was common in the second half of the 20th century. And what it is this. Real estate agents purposefully convinced, for example, a middle-class African-American family that had been living in the inner city and sought to have better schools, safer parks, access to more variety in terms of things like supermarkets, fewer industries, less congestion and pollution, and so on, to purchase a house that's for sale in an overwhelmingly white and middle-class neighborhood. The house sells for a premium because the neighborhood's considered to be a good neighborhood. Then they repeat the strategy. Meanwhile, on the other end, they begin to convince the white residents that their neighborhood is now beginning to decline because there's African Americans moving in, and that they should sell their houses and move to a more distant, whiter suburb. And if they want to be able to recoup their property value, they need to sell soon. By doing this, they get the houses, as in the real estate agents or the developers, get the houses for a cheaper sale price, and then in many cases, flip them. And in some cases, to people they are working with, who then rent or sell them to other families of color. Meanwhile, the real estate agents engage in this and continue to accrue that 3 to 6% fee that they get every time they sell a house. Can you see why this is illegal? Yeah, it's openly racist and plays on both the aspirations and the fears of people. And yet it was very common. Inglewood, Compton, South LA, East LA, Garden Grove, Westminster, Anaheim, they have all experienced versions of this. And in fact, both of those things. And in fact, as Hispanic families of new immigrants especially moved into the poorer neighborhoods, oftentimes those neighborhoods that had been dominated by African Americans, what ends up happening is those people, the African Americans, leave. A kind of black flight in a way. This process of change was helped along by another illegal activity that's known as redlining. This occurs when banks and insurance companies determine that they will not loan money or only provide highly inflated rates for insurance and loans to areas or neighborhoods that are older and in need of repairs. Let's face it, houses, buildings can go on for centuries, but they need upkeep. And in poorer neighborhoods, landlords and property managers oftentimes refuse to upgrade structures in ways that would cut into their profits, which causes those structures to degrade to the point of being barely worthy of human habitation. If the local residents happen to own the property, they live in a place that may be very difficult to get loans to upgrade because of redlining. Thus, the neighborhood declines. Property values decline, which decreases property taxes, which then decreases governmental investment in the neighborhood. Schools are paid for primarily by property taxes. And because of these things, only the poorest of the poor will live there. And this is in the part of the city that was once the wealthiest part of the city 100 or 120 years ago. That deterioration is a physical decline combined with an economic decline. Remember, in many cases, these neighborhoods were once either well off or solidly middle class. But that lack of the ability to invest and upkeep the area, the lack of a solid tax base and governmental investment, the lack of owner-occupied residencies caused a literal physical decline of the structures and the infrastructure in the area. That decrease in the tax base, which then extends to the schools, the parks, the streets, public safety, and so on, can cause the neighborhood to spiral downwards, sometimes rapidly. Not every landlord operates like this, of course. I have a close friend with many rental properties in the poor areas of Long Beach, like what we call Northtown and the West Side. And his philosophy is that he will not rent a house that he himself or his family would not live in. So his rentals are nicely put together and kept up. But most people are looking to maximize the profit in their business, not taking a bit of a cut to provide a decent place to live for, in the case of my buddy, overwhelmingly immigrant populations. People have dignity, regardless of the socioeconomic status. And when everything is boiled down to money, human dignity disappears in the equation. This situation of declining housing in the inner city impacts the entire urban structure, but it impacts no one like it does those who, as a result of their poverty, cannot afford to live anywhere else. And it can potentially create a permanent and cyclical impoverishment of people who cannot escape that cyclical nature of poverty. There are a lot of things that contribute to this, for sure. But their surrounding physical environment is definitely one of them. They might work in, they probably do, work in low-paying jobs without benefits like healthcare, insurance, and retirement. As a result, they cannot generate savings. Their children probably go to underfunded schools without access to technology and resources that allow for upward mobility through education. Other services like parks and recreation may be sparse and or underfunded and not kept up and not safe. The unhoused or homeless population is probably higher than the wealthier parts in the city. And the crime rates are probably higher as well than they are in the wealthier parts of the city. Where are there more homeless people? Santa Ana or Irvine? Why? Obviously, most people living in this inner city are good people who need decent housing and want the best for their families. If you're born into a family with two parents, both of whom have university degrees, they own their own house in a really nice neighborhood where crime is low, the schools are excellent, they can afford to take you on international vacations every year, they introduce you to the arts and cultural events, they have a private French and a private Mandarin tutor or teacher for you, and they have enough wealth to afford top-notch private schools at all levels if that's where you want to go, then you have advantages that someone living in a household with one parent who has a sixth grade education, no expendable income, no internet service, and cannot afford the cultural and artistic enhancement, barely makes rent each month, and so on, is going to have. This doesn't mean person A, the well-off person, may not fall flat on their face. And it doesn't mean that person B, the poor person, will not end up as a CEO of a Fortune 500 company. But all the data shows that for person B, this is going to be spectacularly more challenging. How do we solve this? I have no idea. I don't. But let's hope that we can figure it out.